Hi, I'm Professor Kit Messham-Muir from Curtin University in Perth, Western Australia. I'm the Chief Lead Investigator of Art in Conflict, an Australian Research Council linkage project in partnership with the Australian War Memorial and the National Trust, New South Wales, also with collaborators from the University of Melbourne, University of New South Wales Art and Design, and the University of Manchester. And the purpose of the project is to look at contemporary art about war and terror, and to consider the political complexities of particularly official war art, but also looking at non-official war art in Australia and around the world. One of the really interesting outputs from this project has been 3 symposia that we held in 2019. The first of those was in Sydney in February 2019, held at the S.H. Irving Gallery. The second was in May 2019, held in partnership with War Studies at King's College London. And the third, in Los Angeles, was held at the Torrance Art Museum on the 17th of August 2019. In this third video from War, Art and Visual Culture Los Angeles, Dr. Sarah Minslow from Cal State talks to our second keynote, Dr. Laura Brandon. Dr. Brandon is a former historian at the Canadian War Museum and someone who was instrumental in formulating the Canadian Forces Artist Program, which is their current official war art program at this point.
Thanks for coming, everyone. So I wanted to start off, just if anyone does have questions as we're talking, or you want to make comments, feel free to chime in. It's very conversational. So I wanted to ask you, Laura, if you could explain a little bit about the Canadian program for the war artist, and then if you wanted to talk a little bit about how it differs from the program in Australia, the US, and Britain.
Okay, is this on? Can you hear me? Good. So I don't have a very loud voice, despite having worked with military people for a long time. I started working at the Canadian War Museum a long time ago in 1992, and at that point they had what was officially a third official war art program. They'd had one during the First World War and one during the Second World War, and then they had what they called the Cold War program, and it was cut in 1993 because of budget cutbacks, and it was considered unnecessary to the military's endeavours to have a war art program. And then 9/11 came, and a renewed interest in things military, particularly in Canada because they were so close to the events of that date. And it was determined that they would like to start a new program. One of the other incentives was that I curated an exhibition called Campus of War, which was about the First and Second World War programs that had toured across Canada and had been seen by 500,000 people, and this impressed the powers that be. So they thought, wow, there's an interest in war art, perhaps we better invest in it. So they ran a pilot program in 2002, and the program was called the Canadian Forces Artists Program. And it was an interesting program to set up because right off the bat it was decided that this would be a cooperative venture between the Canadian War Museum, the National Gallery of Art, the National Archives in Canada, and the Department of National Defence. And they all had representatives there, as did the Canada Council, which is the chief sort of government funder for artistic endeavours. So the pilot project was a question of involving 3 artists. It was determined they'd be Army, Air Force, and Navy. And that was where some of the interesting things happened. First off, for the Navy, despite my best efforts, we ended up with an artist that the Navy wanted, who had painted lots of ships and made them look just like they wanted them to look like. And we couldn't budge them away from that artist. The Air Force was also very concerned that it be represented with what we call, and maybe they're called that elsewhere, the people that paint every rivet on the aircraft. And so they got an artist who was really into representational art. And the only place I got any leverage with that pilot project was with the artist representing the army who went to Afghanistan. And he immediately ran into a huge problem, despite being a well-known Canadian artist, which is that the army wouldn't let him out of beyond Kandahar airfield. So he couldn't go anywhere, except round and round and round the perimeter. And so he felt that he had really betrayed the commission because he could do so little. But what resulted was enough to make the program happen. And every 2 years there's a juried competition, which is run by under the Canada Council's system of peer review. And people send in applications, and normally every 2 years between 5 and 10 artists are accepted into the program, and then they are assigned usually to the place that they're interested in. And if they can't go to the place that they're interested in because too many people want to go to the Arctic, for example, they're encouraged to go elsewhere. The program is probably unique because it is totally uncontrolled in terms of what you produce. The artists get the experience, they get transportation, they get somewhere to stay, but they are not told what to create, and they're also, contrary to the previous programs, not expected to give their work away to a government collection. They can do whatever they want with it. So one artist in particular, in fact the one that was in the Army pilot project, regularly stands on Parliament Hill when he's upset about something and tears up his official war art as a protest. This is perfectly okay. The forces that be standing apart from what's produced, and I think it makes it one of the most independent programs in the world because of that. And they have judiciously stuck to it, and I think credit has to go to the Department of National Defence for actually saying, this is okay, we don't mind if we get good and bad. We hope it's good, but we accept that there might be bad. And this means that within the military culture, there's an acceptance of differing viewpoints, and it's encouraged a conversation about what is military art within that particular culture. Now, this hasn't prevented, obviously, certain artists being much more successful with the military themselves. For example, a photographer went on one of the programs, and she produces photographs of people like the Marine SEALs out there wrapped around with Canadian flags, staring at the sunset and so on. And these are immensely popular because they meet with many military personnel's just feeling about who they are and how they would like to be projected. And that is quite important. Anyway, to go back to some of the problems with the program, one of the big issues is reaching out to the art community itself, and we've had to rely increasingly on the Canada Council, who do juried competitions all the time, to reach out to the community and encourage them to apply, because nobody gets paid anything, they just get the accommodation and the travel. And that's helped enormously in increasing the number of applications. When the program first started, however, when applications were somewhat more limited, the department thought, well, we'll just let everybody go. And that led to a temporary blip in the quality of the work that was produced, because the variety of skills was huge. And while everybody was delighted to be able to go, it raised issues about future artists wanting to participate in the program that didn't have some kind of qualitative element to selection. Also, early on, one of the big issues was that artists who wanted to go to Afghanistan could not, because the army was not prepared to cover them insurance-wise. So, and they weren't prepared to let them go at their own risk either. And this was very problematic. So for quite a number of years, Afghanistan was off the books as far as Canadian war artists were concerned. Now, exhibiting the work when the program started, it didn't have much traction, and I have to tell you that it runs to this day on 25,000 Canadian dollars a year, which is peanuts. And that basically goes into the flight and the accommodation, and that's it. So the original, in the early days, the artists would have to agree to drive up to Ottawa, frame their own works, and hang their own works if they could find anywhere to hang them. But normally what happened was they put up a few easels in the National Defence Headquarters, and they just sort of leaned them on the easels, and that was the exhibition. Over the years, it's gone a bit more upmarket, and with the growing interest in the program. And 2 years ago, with group sixth group that went out, they're on to group 9 at the moment, there was an exhibition in an ancillary military venue to the Canadian War Museum, which is called the Diefenbunker. It's one of those underground anti-nuclear war places where you put the Prime Minister and so on if there's a nuclear attack. And that was hugely successful and led to the Canadian War Museum agreeing to host an exhibition every 2 years of art from each group. And that has elevated the program very, very high, because the Canadian War Museum is a national institution, so it gives a profile to the artists. Over the period of the 17 years the program has been alive, 70 artists have participated. Initially they were painters, now they're primarily photographers, but with an increasing number of videographers. It's actually open to all the arts, and very, very occasionally we get something different. Like we once had people writing an opera. We've had people applying who write haiku. We've had a dramatist, and we've had a number of poets. But it has stayed primarily oriented to the two-dimensional. Very few sculptural works, very few video works. And in many respects, it's not attracting the high-end, front-running Canadian artists. I don't know why, but it does attract artists who want to find out what it is like to be with the military. And generally speaking, they tend to be enormously inspired, which leads to another problem, because that being inspired by the military experience also leads to a kind of comfort level of being with them, which then raises issues about, you know, these guys have all become your friends. How can you possibly say anything nasty about them? And then if they don't understand the art, and you feel, oh my goodness, I'm betraying my new friends, I better do something that they're comfortable with. So it becomes a kind of, as I said, I use the word conversation, so it's a continuing conversation between the creative world and the military world, trying to find a way in which both are happy with how they are identified. And the minute that happens, you have bias and all that kind of stuff entering into it. So it's a complicated setup, but in general, most of the artists are able to show their work, sell their work, and many have gained significant reputations. We had our first war artist get the Order of Canada this year, which is Canada's highest honour, and that was for 25 years of work, military and war art. She'd been to Afghanistan, and she'd also been on a training mission. She'd done a lot, so she was completely embedded with the military world. And others have had them. We had another one this year who got the military merit medal, which was important too.
Thank you. Any questions?
I've got one. You mentioned very briefly that the high-profile artists tend to stay away from the program, and you said that you don't know what the reason for that is. Do you have an opinion for why that is?
I think the program, much like Canada Council grants in their own right, provides resume fodder. So it tends to attract applicants who are trying to build a profile, and a national profile at that. It's also, it can be dangerous. Also, some of the older, more mature, experienced artists are much older. We have got one that's who's older than me, and it's quite hard because you have to live with the military. It's not the easiest environment necessary to be with, and you're very controlled. They also, if they don't need to go, why go? And some of the best military artists don't need to go. They get their inspiration from what they find in the media and so on. You don't have to have the experience necessarily. But I don't think there's not a huge interest in military art in Canada, avant-garde military art, as opposed to pictures of aircraft and vessels and so on. So, of those high-end artists I know, I think most of it is they don't need to go, and they don't want to leave their comfort zone, and they've all got enough work to do anyway, and commissions to complete and so on and so forth, to need that particular experience. It's very much a stepping stone, and it validates them as artists. It has a lot of other stuff associated with it. I had to fight really, really hard because at one point they all thought their work automatically went into the Canadian War Museum, which it doesn't. It's never been part of the program. So you'd have CVs would come in, you know, I'm in the collection of the Canadian War Museum, which they weren't. So it's a bit complicated. I don't know if that answers your question.
Is that, no, it's something that we've certainly come across in a number of different contexts. And I was also curious in the Canadian, as it were, public sort of sphere, is there a sense of perception of like a stigma of doing a project like that one becomes associated with like a propaganda machine for the army? Is there a sense of, one of the things that we're interested in the program, in the project that we're doing, is precisely how artists negotiate this position of working with the army and not for the army. So that kind of fine balance. You're quite explicitly kind of saying artists do whatever they want, but there's still a sense of perception, you are now a war artist.
Well, artists don't do what they want necessarily. Once they're in the machine, so to speak, they are affected, and they always have been through history by the environment in which they're working. You know, there are issues of morale, issues of patriotism, nationalism, all those things come into play. I think one of the big problems is that the First and Second World War programs are very well known now, and sort of epitomise the ultimate achievement in Canadian war art. You know, these paintings get published, they're exhibited a lot, and they're huge and they're massive. So the whole concept is that war art has to be a statement of national identity. And it's quite hard when you go into a war zone or a military zone to work out how you can make art that equates with this precedent. And I think that's one of the big challenges for the artists. They have to get out of their heads the fact that they're doing, they're just supposed to respond to the experience. They're not necessarily going to have to expect to make grand the history of Canadian military involvement in recent years, because it's certainly been quite modest generally. Another issue is the whole business of gender, because the First and Second World War programs are so oriented towards the masculine view of war. The hardest task I had when I was involved was to persuade people to not do that over and over and over again, to eschew trying to produce Navy SEALs all over the place and look at weakness and fear and some of the stuff that probably people are not used to looking at. They certainly weren't then as much as they might be now, because the media has changed. I mean, social media allows a lot more to be seen. But there is a kind of perception that you have to produce great work because this is for a great cause and it has to be suitable for a great institution or something like that, and that does affect how they approach art making, and it is a limitation on courage, really.
I'm just thinking, because I'm comparing what you're talking about to the British Official War Artists program and the Australian Official War Artists program. as well. And the thing that interested me about the Canadian one was the fact that, artists propose a project, and there's several artists, and it's almost like a resident civic in that respect, as opposed to the other programs which will go through quite a sort of, stringent curating and vetting sort of process in order to come around to an artist that the curators at those institutions will think will respond to work in particular ways. And as a result of that, you get things like, for instance, in the UK, where you had Stephen McQueen's Queen of the Country, which was an incredibly poignant work that was very controversial, where he produced stamps for every British soldier that had been killed, during the Afghanistan campaign at that point. Thinking in the Australian context, someone like Ben Quilty, who has produced portraits of soldiers with PTSD, these kind of slightly metaphysical sort of portraits, and has drawn a huge amount of attention to that. And I suppose in a way I've always thought that the British and the Australian programs are very prescriptive in one sense, that I think because there's so much structure around those deployments that it's potentially constrained what the artist does. But it sounds like the other way of doing it, which the Canadian way of doing it, which I always kind of thought, I sort of idealized as being like, this is much better, artists can apply, and it sounds like that has its own restrictions as well, or its own limitations because of the structure of that.
I don't think it's the structure, I think it's the Canadian mentality.
It's the national psyche.
Yeah, the national psyche. I mean, I mentioned the woman artist she's a bit older than me. She flew over the Arctic and the Northwest Territories and Nunavut and so on, and produced massive paintings of what you see from a plane window of these unpeopled areas. And she was inspired because her father had flown and mapped Canada during the Second World War and just after from an aircraft. Now those artworks have gone into public collections because they don't look very military, and so that has an impact as well. You really are not going to find much military art in public collections. It is the Canadian psyche. I think people fear reaction. I once showed a work by Gertrude Kearns called What They Gave, which was an Afghanistan work featuring two wounded Canadians and one wounded Afghani. And the wounded Canadian had lost both legs, and there was red paint all over the place. It's pretty gory, I guess. And I was advised to hide it behind a corner because it might upset visitors. So, and yet I was interested in this, so I did a mini little survey when the exhibition was in Victoria, British Columbia, and I asked visitors if two things. First, if they'd noticed it, and nobody remembered seeing it. And secondly, what did the paintings remind them of? So one of the Afghan works reminded people of their honeymoon somewhere in the Caribbean with sandy beaches and things. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Why are we worrying about what people think when in fact they're not thinking what we think they're thinking at all? And we shouldn't be so careful and so sort of Presbyterian about what we allow people to see. And Canadians, generally speaking, would prefer everything military to be in the form of memorial. So that in sculptures that are kind of abstracted in some way, shape or form, or that just show people feeling sad and sorry, which accounts for their huge enthusiasm for Remembrance Day. That's when people get really interested in things military, because that's the okay way to be. You're remembering the past and can be sentimental about it. You're not actively engaging in the present and its problems.
I think that Canada was involved in the conflict in Afghanistan. And I suppose it surprises me because I think that when, I think the Australian context, he was an extremely controversial involvement. There were protests where millions of people literally took to the streets in Melbourne, etc. Was there that kind of response in Canada?
There's always a bit of protest, but it's not at that level, no. Because the engagement is so minimal. We have a tiny, tiny armed forces, relatively speaking. I mean, I think it's less than 60,000 at the moment. I think we're hard pressed to find a ship that was actually able to stay on the water at the moment. And we have Sea King helicopters still, which I think are almost as old as me. And only staying here thanks to spare parts. It's a big geographical entity with a small population, and most people's main interest is healthcare, which uses up most of the budget. So it has no interest in developing a military. So it's not part of people's worldview, and the bulk of its population have in recent years escaped horrendous situations. I mean, we've had huge Syrian immigration in recent years, and I think it would be very hard for a lot of new Canadians to find out that this country of peace and peacefulness that believes in peacekeeping is suddenly going to gear itself up. But I told you the story, which slightly surprised me. I was teaching a course on war last winter, and I was showing the students protest art in Britain, and I asked them if they'd ever felt any desire to protest. These are third and fourth year students, 2021, and they sort of looked at me blankly. Protest, what is that? And I said, well, take for example the fact that Canadians are selling armoured personnel carriers to the Saudis, which are then being used in Yemen, killing thousands of people. Does that not upset you? Should Canada be doing that? And they sort of looked at me blankly and said, oh yes, because we need the jobs. So I think there's a reality out there that we've sort of been cotton wool balled into a kind of comfort zone, maybe. It makes it very hard for us to connect. War is always at a distance, conflict is always at a distance, but we're safe in Canada, which is generally a middle-class society, which has all sorts of social support networks, including healthcare, so on and so forth. It's pretty hard to fall between the cracks. Now, many would argue that that's not politically very sensible, because the world is changing and we can't defend our northern borders, etc., etc. So what are we going to do? But there's no appetite for it generally, because there's no money. Too small a population to support very generous healthcare, education, everything else that we have to, infrastructure, which big country, 30 odd million people supporting through their taxes roads that have to cross the same geographical line masses here. These are bigger financial issues for most Canadian governments, and that filters into how the population views things military.
So we're almost out of time, but I wanted to get your take on this idea of then, maybe in the global context, not just Canada, but what's the function then of war art, and why do we continue to make it and consume it and invest in it? What do you see as being the important functions, and how might that have changed since even 9/11?
Sorry, can you swap microphones around?
Yeah.
Aha, I'm louder. Sorry about that. I may have said words of wisdom, perhaps. Words of idiocy. I hope the words of wisdom were heard and the words of idiocy were not. I don't really feel qualified to speak globally because I live in Canada and that's what I know best. But there's no doubt in my mind that the function of Canadian war art is as a site of memory. Its function is largely commemorative. I suspect in Britain that they feel similarly inclined. I still can't get over the response to the pop poppies in the Tower of London, and how people could look at those millions and millions of poppies and somehow abstract the meaning of conflict and the consequences of conflict into... I still have problems with poppies, pretty flowers, because to me that is... It's very sad because it makes it possible for us to dismiss the actual realities of combat to sort of sentimental, make it sentimental essentially. But if you look historically across war art internationally, by and large, with the exception, I would say notably of the United States, especially during the Vietnam War, most countries use it to commemorate and to build up their national histories that way. Canada had nothing equivalent to the art that came out during the Vietnam War or during the Iraq War, when we weren't participants in that war. And we weren't participants in the Vietnam War either, and I think that makes a huge difference because Australia was in Vietnam as well. We have such a small history, and it's... What are you going to protest if we're just sending out people to help in kitchens in wherever, Syria or somewhere like that, 20 people, that's not the stuff you make a protest art about. So I think war art relates to the investment a country makes in its own military. That answers the question, sort of.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for your questions and comments. We're going to have a quick break. Is that right? So there's coffee in the foyer, and we'll be around if you want to talk more.